We made a big deal out of this because it feels as if not only is this a huge issue for the Republican Party, but the country seems to be moving even more so in an abortion rights direction since Dobbs. I mean, you are seeing this evidence here, and it seems like the Republican Party is pulling itself further away. Well, we're in something's got to give.
Right. And we are on the precipice of a Republican primary for president where these issues are going to be front and center. Now, the interesting thing about how this issue played in the last election, right? Everybody tried to figure out which was going to be more important, abortion, the economy, abortion or the economy. The answer was really both. It depended on what, right? So in states, what surprised me, I guess, the most was that in states where abortion restrictions were put on the books, were passed into law, Georgia, Texas, Florida, Republicans did really well. In states where the threat of more abortion restrictions were on the ballot, literally, Michigan being an example of that. To me, the issue was the candidates themselves and how they talked about this issue. In Pennsylvania and in Arizona, they were over the top versus being, let's say, another Republican candidate, Brian Kemp, et cetera, who's talking about being reasonable. So the debate really hasn't happened in a national way. It still has happened at the state level.
I look at, there's one more race I'd bring up, Eugene, that to me, I'm starting to question whether we spent too much time either crediting or blaming Trump for the results or Trump-like candidates and not enough on abortion. Because the only place where a Democrat incumbent governor lost was in a state where abortion rights were already enshrined in the Constitution, and that was Nevada, right? Where it was off the table, where he didn't have to have a discussion, and the economy got to be front and center, where it wasn't front and center. And so this just looks like, and I see no evidence that GOP knows how to get out of this box.
Well, last weekend, we know Kevin McCarthy was talking to GOP donors, and he seemed to adopt the talking point that Mitch McConnell has been emphasizing, which is candidate quality. He said that states that have people who ran for the governor's race in the Republican Party who lost in part because not just their quality of the House candidates, but also the gubernatorial candidates. And so what I think we're going to see Republicans doing moving forward is saying, how do we get people at the top of the ticket who are not as extreme as we have seen in some of these states like Arizona, like Pennsylvania, and even Georgia. I mean, we remember Herschel Walker and his whole abortion stories. That didn't help that party.
You know, Brendan, the RNC just did a resolution at their winter meeting that shows that they're not looking at the polling on abortion. They said the Republican National Committee urges Republican lawmakers in state legislatures and in Congress to pass the strongest pro-life legislation possible, such as laws that acknowledge the beating hearts and experiences of pain of the unborn. This is not what the public wants.
No, and we've been making statements like that for decades, really, and it just really hadn't had any real consequences until now. We're a party where at the national level, we're being defined by state house legislators. You know, instead of having a national message that explains, even if you're pro-life and you support overturning Roe, talking about how you're going to take care of mothers or newborn children. There's a way to talk about this that is a little less politically damaging, but no one has taken...
Has anybody figured it out?
Nobody's taken that over. I mean, instead, we're being defined by states that are going to the far extremes, which is in conflict with how we've talked about this forever, which is that we want reasonable middle ground restrictions, and instead we're going all the way, and it's catching up with us.
Why can't you do that? Well, because I think it is happening. Why can't you go back to that? It's about the states.
Well, I think you could do it, but nobody seems to have the courage to do it. I mean, the first slate of bills the House took up this year was anti-abortion measures, which tells me, you know, the people that they're listening to, the people that make the most noise, don't see any real reason to change course.
Well, and that's when you hear Mitch McConnell talking about candidate quality. Candidate quality is true, but not for a primary. For a primary, it's the most radicalized part of a party that will actually come out. It's the ones that are more moderate, independent, that stay home for primary voters. And so that is their challenge, is that they have gone so far to the right that they have to have these conversations. I mean, it's not shocking that when they run up for re-election or they aspire to be president, they're like, don't forget that I was the one that introduced the anti-abortion bill.
The only thing to keep an eye on is that Republican voters are also moving away from it.
No, they are. They are. No, they are. But
in that sense, right, they don't. We saw it in this
Kansas.
And also in this survey indicated where they're saying, look, clearly there are plenty of Republican voters who are very pro-life, who are willing to support candidates who are not, if they agree with them on the other issues. But I don't know if they can get there.
Right. Well, but the challenge is, again, is who comes out to vote in primaries. Yeah. And on both sides, it's their base. And right now, their base is highly radicalized. And so those independent, moderate voters are going to have to decide, am I going to actually go for the one that might be moderate, or maybe I just stay home, or I go for the moderate Democrat, which is actually what we saw in the midterm.
And, you know, Amy, look, I think a presidential nominee can talk their way out of some stuff. You can do that sometimes. And Donald Trump certainly is trying on this issue in a weird way. It's his judges that overturned it, but he's going,
they went too far.
They went too far. But to me, the ones that are really trapped are the Senate candidates. I mean, I looked at this morning and went, oh, this is how Democrats hold the Senate. It was just suddenly you realize, because it just looks like an impossible map for them to navigate. And then you look, oh, wait, look at the abortion issue in Montana and in Ohio and in West Virginia. And one issue in a Senate race can be enough.
Well, this is a Democratic group, did polling after the election, Navigator Research, looked at the people who said they didn't approve of the job that Biden was doing on the economy, including 13% who said they were somewhat unfavorable. The number one issue for those 13%, abortion, not the economy. So this is where we got really kind of,
I don't think the after-action report is fully, let's just say, I don't think we fully know everything yet. I think this was more of an abortion election.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. That's right.
Yeah.
Right. That those folks who they say the economy is bad, but when you really push them to say, well, what is a more important issue to you, inflation or abortion access, they picked abortion.
Well, and to Amy's point, what was surprising was that it was dads that had swayed more to actually vote against the abortion. So it wasn't the traditional, it's going to be the moms, it's going to be the women. No, it was the people who had fathers who had daughters that were part of that. And that is, I think, something that's incongruous with the Republican platform, because that's also their base.
I want to pick up something, Eugene, that Brendan brought up, which is how Republicans could start to talk about this differently. You know, when the Mississippi passed their law to basically get this to the Supreme Court, I had Governor Reeves on the show. And that was all Governor Reeves talked about. He goes, you know what, we as a party need to do better about supporting women when they have kids, after the child is born and while they're pregnant. And we need to give them more resources, and we should be doing these things. And you've heard at times Marco Rubio talk about this. I'll be curious to see if a presidential candidate really tries to grab this and actually makes this, because it would be also something to hand out, like money. Like, look, we know voters like that too.
Right. I mean, it's been a long time since we've heard anything about compassionate conservatism. There was a time when that is what was the mainline viewpoint on this issue, which is what Brendan was making note of. Some say Nikki Haley would be perfectly positioned to take this lane for a host of reasons. The question becomes, will she be able to, in a party that has so many individuals in its base that are far more vocal than Haley, who view this issue quite differently?
All you need to know is how the Iowa caucuses work, Brendan. And the fact is, Rick Santorum had an abortion position that was outside the Republican mainstream in 2012, but it was really fired up voters in the caucuses in Iowa.
Yeah, it's not the first time, the only issue where we're held captive by a small sliver of our party. And we've been making this pact with social conservatives for decades, and it didn't really matter. I'm not actually convinced that talking about these things differently is necessarily going to win the argument, but at least it gives you something to do to change the conversation.
You need to change the subject,
from
right?
Where's the line, which is never a good conversation to have, to how are you trying to be part of the solution, which is what people are looking for when they talk to someone.
Let me ask you this. The pushback I'll always get from my Republican friends are, but Democrats' position on abortion on demand is not popular. And I always said, but where's that being debated?
Yeah, well, the problem is Republicans, again, are being defined in places like Texas and Georgia and other states where they're going well beyond what we had long talked about. Again, something that, as working in Republican politics, the message I carried for a long time was that we just want to have somewhere in the middle a reasonable standard where, at some point it is illegal. And that is no longer the conversation. It's an all or nothing. And if it's all or nothing, Republicans are going to lose that conversation.
And I guess the question now is, at what point do Democrats need to, because it looks like this has to get codified in Congress. Yeah. And so do Democrats need to be campaigning on a piece of legislation. This is what we're going to do. We're going to codify this. We're going to codify Roe or Roe Plus or whatever you want to call it.
I don't know if they need a piece of legislation, but they need a framework in which they're going to actually put forward so that you can get a lot of the moderate independent Republicans. And I think that is how you actually get to the White House. Because it's not, and that's what the midterm taught us, that it wasn't just the most progressives of the Democratic base, but it was independent, moderate Republicans who felt either they sat home or they joined the party because they said democracy's at stake. So what are the arguments around democracy, perhaps, that we could say about women's rights around abortion? There we're starting to facilitate what that framework could look like.
But that's I think where Democrats would get in trouble too if they had to legislate something. And I think
Well,
I think the party.
I'm curious about. I don't know.
The party would never.
That's why it
allow
would be a
them-
framework.
Yeah,
That's why
the
it's
party
okay.
would never allow them to do anything that other than there would be no restrictions at any time, and that would be deeply unpopular, I think, and they would have a very hard time passing that. So they run in some ways they run into the same problem that we do, that you have to go to the extreme.
Well, here's the
I don't
irony.
know, yeah.
20 weeks.
To pass something, absolutely.
20 weeks, arguably, if you say, what's the compromise? If you really were just looking at it, what's the compromise between 24 and 15, you might say 20. Could a majority of Democrats do that, Amy?
No,
Yeah,
that's
I don't
probably
think so.
untrue. But
Right.
here's the bigger question. Can Ron DeSantis run on a 15-week ban, or does he need to come out for something stronger? Especially
It's a
when he
great
goes to...
look.
Right.
I
That's
thought.
exactly right.
I always thought
Because I thought 15 is easier to defend. You say 15, this is very reasonable. This is very...
what is it? 90% of abortions are done
That's right.
before the
Most
first
people
15.
want
Yeah.
somewhere in that question.
But he
is,
doesn't want to own it.
No.
Nobody, you know, the
No.
15-week thing polls well if you say 5 or 6 different options, and it's all right, it's the best of the bad options. But that's the problem that the party has, and nobody wants to own 15 weeks. Nobody says, this is the right policy. Everybody looks at it as this is a compromise policy, and nobody wants to be excited about compromise.
Well, because you risk, in an effort to win people, losing the people who get you that far, right? And everyone
They'll
is
do the door
focused on
knocking.
the base.
Yeah.
Or what would be really wonderful is just to let the science actually take place and actually be the determinant factor of when it's actually safe for a woman to have an abortion. But that's harder.
You're asking,
Science.
You're asking for metrics and things like that.
Medical procedure.